Hi, thank you for joining me. I'm Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. I will link the playlist here for anyone who wants it. Today, though, I'm going to be focusing on propositions 166 through 168. And as I have been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. And as always, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version of the text. From today, I'm starting on a section of propositions that focuses on intellects, or nous in Greek. Now, this series of videos is really long, I know. So I just want to take a moment to say that I do appreciate those of you who have been following the entire series. It takes a lot of work to see the vision of reality that Proclus is unfolding for us. So if you're still in the game after all this time, you deserve to give yourself a pat on the back. It is a real challenge, but I would add that it is a rewarding endeavor. And if these videos are helping you, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. And also, let me know in the comments how the study is going for you. Is it a struggle? Have you had any insights? Have you hit any mental blocks that make it hard to focus? Or maybe you've had an exciting aha moment. Whatever it is, let me know. I would love to hear from you. Okay, well, enough of that. I'm starting today with Proposition 166. And this one reads, there is both unparticipated and participated intelligence. And the latter is participated either by supramundane or by intramundane souls. And just as a reminder for those of you who are new to this odd sort of vocabulary that Proclus uses, supramundane refers to souls at the psychical level, rational souls, we might say. Intramundane souls refers to souls at the mundane level, where elsewhere they have been called irrational soul, or it's that aspect of soul that is tied more closely to physical bodies. And Proclus's explanation begins, for of the whole number of intelligences, the unparticipated is sovereign, having primal existence. So there's the unparticipated monad, then the participated monad, and then it's followed by all the participants in the series. And that's the basic hierarchy that was laid out in Propositions 23 and 24. I've gone back to those many times, so I imagine you're already familiar with them, and I'm going to go on now. The next sentence reads, and of the participated intelligences, some irradiate the supramundane and unparticipated soul, but others the intramundane. Now, in my last video, I talked about there being an analogous relationship between terms across ranks. Higher terms in the divine series are coordinate with higher terms in subsequent series. This statement follows from that. It's the same basic logic being applied here. For the intramundane class cannot proceed without mediation from the unparticipated intelligence, since all procession is through like terms, and a class which is independent of the world order bears more likeness to the unparticipated than one which is locally distributed. You might recall from my previous video that there has to be a medium between the mundane and the intellectual realms. Intramundane souls are locally distributed, and so they cannot participate directly in intellect. Supramundane souls, on the other hand, are above the mundane realm, and they function as that which governs it. So these rational souls, therefore, do participate intellect. And indeed, this is why they are called rational souls. And then Proclus goes on to say, nor again is the supramundane class the only one. There must be intramundane intelligences. First, because there are intramundane gods. And that came from Proposition 165. And since that was my last video, I am going to just scroll up to remind you of what that was. And that one reads, all those henads are intramundane, which any sensible body participates. And so that was showing the unfolding of reality, how intellect carries the gods, if you will, into the realms of reality, into the realms of what exists or what is. You can think of the intelligences then as the vehicles for the gods, much as soul is the vehicle for intelligence, as we'll see later on. But going back here, Proclus goes on to say that secondly, because the world order itself is possessed of intelligences as well as of soul. So he's telling us that we live in an intelligent universe. And third, because intramundane souls participate supramundane intelligences through the mediation of intelligences which are intramundane. And that requires a bit of review of Proposition 109. And this one reads that every particular intelligence can participate the first henad, which is above intelligence, either through the universal intelligence or also through the particular henad coordinate with it. So there are two ways to participate. Also, every particular soul participates the universal intelligence through the universal soul, and also it can participate through its particular intelligence, and that's really what applies to what we're looking at now. And then he also adds here that every particular corporeal nature participates the universal soul, both through universal nature and through a particular soul. So this one, you might recall, is sort of an application, if you will, of 108. This was the general principle here, that every particular member of any order can participate the monad of the rank immediately supraadjacent in one of two ways. Supraadjacent again meant the order just above, or the rank just above. Either through the universal of its own order or through the particular member of the higher series, which is coordinate with it in respect of its analogous relation to that series as a whole. And so now what we're seeing in Proposition 166 is an application of this. And so we're getting a better picture, a more vivid image, if you will, of this intricate metaphysical map that Proclus is unfolding for us. Okay, Proposition 167. This is one of the key propositions in the whole book. Although you could make the case that this one is really just laying some of the metaphysical foundation for Proposition 168. Either way, there's a whole lot going on here. So this one reads, every intelligence has intuitive knowledge of itself, but the primal intelligence knows itself only, and intelligence and its object are here numerically one. Whereas each subsequent intelligence knows simultaneously itself and its priors, so that its object is in part itself, but in part its source. To better see what Proclus is pointing out here, a diagram might be helpful. In my previous video, we saw Proclus reiterating Plotinus' teaching that the intelligible is both being and thought. That being is the content of the intellect. Now Proclus is stating that intellect knows only itself. On the surface, this seems like a contradiction, but let's see why it is not really one. The common image is that intellect turns back to its cause, which is being. However, we often forget or we don't fully appreciate that intellect and being are not separate at the intelligible. As the intelligible, They are consubsistent. And this is what Proclus means when he states that they are numerically one. In other words, it might be more helpful in this current context to think of the intelligible as a unity that reverts on itself. It is the content of its own thoughts. When we are talking about that content, we call it being. When we are talking about that intellectual activity of reverting on itself and knowing itself, we call it intellect. As the first that is, it is the highest knowable being. That which is beyond it, or the conditions for it to be, are unknowable. But this being is completely unified. It turns on itself and it knows itself. It creates itself and it sustains itself. It is self-sufficient and self-constituted. For those of you who want to review these two terms, the self-sufficient is the focus of propositions 9 and 10. And there are a number of propositions on the self-constituted, and they start from proposition 40. Also important to keep in mind, that act of knowing is also a creative act. Subsequent intellects then follow in a series. Each also reverts on itself, because that is the character of intellect that is carried by derivation throughout the series. Remember, there is a monad at the head of the series, and then there are the subsequents in the series. And what the monad is primitively, the subsequents are by derivation. So they all revert on themselves. But in order to know themselves, they must also know their cause. And so these subsequent intellects also revert on their priors. This allows for a chain to form, allowing the lower intellects to know even the highest intelligible intellect. Without this ability to revert to the higher, growth would not be possible. We as intellectual beings would be locked into the mundane energies at the lower end of the metaphysical hierarchy, where the individual soul dominates. Proposition 167, though, is describing the dynamic that makes growth possible. So coming back now to Proposition 167, Proclus tells us that for any intelligence must know either itself or that which is above it or that which is consequent upon it. So Proclus is laying out three logical possibilities. And as he had done in some of the earlier propositions, he's now going to run through each one of them, seeing what follows for each. And he starts here with the last of the three. If the last be true, this will mean that intelligence reverts upon its inferior. So he's starting with the possibility of knowing the consequent. In this scenario, the intellect would be reverting to its inferior. So now he has to tell us why this is not what he is looking for. And he explains, and even so, it will not know the object itself, upon which it has reverted, since it is not within the object, but is extraneous to it. It can know only the impress produced upon it by the object, for it knows its own, not what is alien, its effects, not their extraneous source. In other words, if an intellect knows only its consequence, but not itself or its priors, then it would know the effect without knowing the cause. Now, a basic principle that all of Proclus's reasoning is based on, it's one of the assumptions really that's underlying this whole study, is that causes must be known in order for a thing to be knowable. This idea came up in the propositions in Proposition 11. All that exists proceeds from a single first cause. And in the course of the explanation, he told us that if causes were unknown, there would be no knowledge of their consequence. And so he ended this paragraph by stating that it knows its own, not what is alien, its effects, not their extraneous source. And now, going on to the next page, Proclus moves on to the next possibility. He writes, suppose next that it knows what is above it. So he's looking at the possibility that an intellect knows its cause. And so he is next going to show that this possibility can itself be split into two. He writes, if it know this through knowing itself, it will have simultaneous knowledge of the two. But if it know the higher only, it will be an intelligence that is ignorant of itself. So these are the two possibilities. And now Proclus has to show the absurdity of intellect knowing its cause, but not itself. He writes, there is also the general consideration that if it know its prior, it must know that this prior is a cause, and must know the effects whereof it is a cause. For if it know not these effects, its ignorance of them will involve ignorance of their cause, which produces them in virtue of its being. In other words, if it knows the cause but does not know it as a cause, then this knowledge of the cause is questionable. This knowledge of the cause then would have a big limitation on it. It would be limited by this ignorance. And the paragraph ends. But if it know what its prior constitutes or causes, it will know itself, since it is constituted thence. Thus, if it know its prior, it will necessarily know itself also. So this line of reasoning brings us to see that knowing its cause necessarily brings an intellect to know itself as well, since it is the resultant of that cause. And so this last paragraph is going to tie everything up. He writes, if then there is an intelligible intelligence, in knowing itself being intelligible, it knows the intelligible which is its own being, while each subsequent intelligence knows simultaneously the intelligible which is its own content and the prior intelligible. And Proclus ends then with a summary of all that we just covered. There is thus an intelligible in the intelligence and an intelligence in the intelligible. But the higher intelligence is identical with its object, whereas the lower is identical with its own content, but not with the prior intelligible. For the unconditioned intelligible is distinct from the intelligible in the knower. And now we have arrived at Proposition 168. So Proposition 167 gave us the logical argument behind the metaphysics. But here we're getting the significance of it. And this one reads, every intelligence in the act of intellection knows that it knows. The cognitive intelligence is not distinct from that which is conscious of the cognitive act. By the very act of intellection, every intellect not only knows, but it knows that it knows. I want to focus especially on the last part of this. The cognitive intelligence is not distinct from that which is conscious of the cognitive act. Subject is not separate from the object. So the act of intellecting then results in awareness. Here, conscious is synonymous with aware. In fact, I would actually prefer to replace the word conscious with aware. I think it's clear. The cognitive intelligence is not distinct from that which is aware of the cognitive act. And this distinction will become clear as we go through the explanation. And the explanation starts off, for if it is an intelligence in action, and it knows itself as indistinguishable from its object, then it is aware of itself and it sees itself. Now notice the reference to proposition 167. So that previous proposition is a setup for this one. And here's the word aware. Now outside of Platonism, you often hear divine mind called consciousness. Now I've heard the case made that consciousness ranks higher than awareness. I've heard arguments for awareness ranking higher than consciousness. And sometimes the two words are used synonymously. As a simple example, we can talk of the importance of being conscious of your surroundings. And that really means being aware of your surroundings. But now here's another scenario. Imagine you pass out. You get a high fever, for example, and you're out cold. We would say that you are unconscious. When you first start to come to, you feel groggy. You're not sure where you are, what's going on. You don't know what happened to you. At that moment, you are conscious again, but you're not aware. And so in this example, we're seeing awareness as a higher state of cognition than consciousness. Now, these examples, of course, are all at the physical level. Divine mind is always conscious. And perhaps even more significantly, it is always aware. Many people report experiencing this awareness while they're in a coma or even when they've been declared medically dead. And those instances, of course, are called near-death experiences. And what mystics often refer to as peak experiences or enlightenment experiences or experiences of divine luminosity. These are another example of the experience of the eternal awareness of divine mind. What Platonists call divine intellect or mind could also be called awareness. I personally like the word awareness better than consciousness. I think it better conveys the intelligence of that knowing, that it knows that it knows. The word conscious, and so consciousness, has an ambiguous meaning. It sometimes means the same as awareness, but not always. And so I think the word awareness is more precise. But if you are a person who really likes the word consciousness and you want to use that word, go right ahead. But I hope that you, after looking at Proposition 168, you better appreciate that this, what you call consciousness, denotes this awareness in intellect. And this intelligence is the focus, really, of this proposition. And Proclus explains, seeing itself in the act of knowing and knowing itself in the act of seeing, it is aware of itself as an active intelligence. And being aware of this, it knows not merely what it knows, but also that it knows. And there it is, beautiful summary. And the conclusion? Thus, it is simultaneously aware of the thing known, which is the content that fills it, the absolute realities that we often call ideas or forms, and they're known to each intellect at its own proper level. We've seen intellects at every level, at the mundane level, the psychical level, the intellectual level, as well as the level of the intelligible. And he goes on, of itself as the knower, so it knows that it knows, and of itself as the object of its own intellective act. So when any intellect looks to the realities that it contains and knows them, it also knows that it is that. And this final point points to the maxim that guides every Platonist: know thyself. And that brings us to the end of yet another video. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave those below. Until next time.